Welcome to Voices from Forgotten Souls. Before we begin this powerful true story, tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there right now. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video, and stay with us until the very end, because this story will shake you and teach you something history tried to hide. Now let us step into the island of Martinique, in the Caribbean Sea, during the early 1830s, where faith, fear, and fury met inside a quiet church on a Sunday morning. The bells of St. Pierre rang slowly that morning, their heavy sound floating over the sugar fields and across the narrow dirt roads that led to the grand church at the center of town. The sun was already high, warm and golden, shining on white walls and red roofs. But the beauty of the island could not hide the cruelty that lived beneath it. In those days, Martinique was still under French rule, and slavery was the spine of the sugar empire. Plantations stretched wide, like oceans of green cane, and enslaved men and women bent their backs from sunrise to sunset, cutting, carrying, and bleeding for the wealth of men who called themselves masters. Among those enslaved souls was a man named Jean-Baptiste, though most people on the plantation called him Tinoe. The name sounded small, almost playful, but there was nothing small about the silence that lived inside his eyes. Tinoe was in his early 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands hardened by years of cutting cane and lifting stone. He had been born on the island, but his mother had been brought from West Africa as a young girl. She had told him stories of warriors, of proud villages, of drums that called spirits, and of justice that did not sleep forever. She died when he was 12, after a fever spread through the slave quarters, and Tinoe never forgot the way she held his hand and whispered that a man must never forget who he is, even if chains try to rename him. His master, Monsieur Armand Duclos, owned one of the largest sugar estates near Saint-Pierre. Duclos was respected among white planters, feared among the enslaved, and praised by the church for his generous donations. He wore fine suits even in the heat, carried a polished cane, and spoke softly in public. In private, he was a different man. His overseers were brutal, but Duclos himself enjoyed a colder kind of cruelty. He liked control. He liked fear. He liked knowing that every life on his land could be bent or broken by his word. Tinoe worked mainly in the boiling house, where cane juice was turned into sugar. It was hot like fire, steam rising thick in the air, copper vats bubbling, men shouting as they stirred heavy liquid with long paddles. Burns were common. Accidents were common. Punishment was more common. Yet through all this, Tinoe endured quietly. What kept him alive was his wife, Amélie. She was small, with bright eyes and a voice that could calm a storm inside his chest. She worked in the great house as a domestic servant, cleaning floors, washing clothes, serving meals. They had married in a simple ceremony, led by an old enslaved preacher under a mango tree, with no legal standing in the eyes of the law, but in their hearts it was sacred. At night, when work was done and the moon rose pale over the fields, they would sit outside their small hut and speak in whispers about freedom. Not loud dreams, not foolish plans, just soft hopes. Maybe one day slavery would end. Maybe one day they would have children who would not be owned. Maybe one day the island would change, but inside the walls of the great house, something darker was already unfolding. Monsieur Duclos had begun to notice Amélie. At first it was small things, a lingering stare, a hand that rested too long on her shoulder, a command for her to stay behind after others had left the room. Amélie tried to avoid him, tried to stay close to other servants, tried to keep her head low. She told Tinoe nothing at first, because fear walked with every word. On plantations, accusations against masters often ended with lashes, sale, or death. Yet Duclos was not a man used to denial. One evening, when the sky turned deep purple and thunder rolled far out at sea, Amélie did not return to the slave quarters at the usual hour. Tinoe waited outside their hut, his heart restless. The other women came back in small groups, tired and silent. He asked one of them if she had seen Amélie. The woman looked away and said she had been called to the master's private office. The thunder grew louder. Hours passed before Amélie finally walked down the path. Her steps were slow. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. Her eyes did not rise to meet his. When she reached him, she tried to speak, but no sound came. He saw it then, not just in her clothes, but in the way her spirit seemed to have been pushed down. She trembled as if cold, though the night was warm. Inside their hut, she told him everything in broken whispers. Monsieur Duclos had forced himself on her. She had begged. She had cried. He had laughed softly and told her that no one would believe a slave over him. Tinoe felt something inside him crack, not loudly, but deeply, like wood splitting under slow pressure. He wanted to run to the great house that very moment, to strike Duclos, to scream his name in the courtyard. But he knew what would follow. He would be shot or hanged, and Amélie would suffer more. So he held her and said nothing. The next days were filled with a silence heavier than iron. Duclos continued as if nothing had happened. He even attended church the following Sunday, kneeling in prayer, speaking of mercy and Christian duty. The hypocrisy burned inside Tinoe like hot coals. Amélie tried to continue her duties, but Duclos summoned her again and again. The abuse did not stop. It became routine, hidden behind locked doors and polite smiles. Weeks turned into months. The island prepared for the harvest season, when work would grow even harder. One evening, Amélie collapsed while carrying a tray. The mistress of the house accused her of laziness and ordered her whipped. When Tinoe heard the sound of the lash from the yard, something shifted permanently inside him. He did not shout. He did not cry. Instead, a plan began to form, slow and patient. He remembered his mother's stories of warriors who waited for the right moment. Revenge, she had once said, is not wild anger. It is cold memory. Tinoe began to watch. He observed the routines of the house, the guards, the paths Duclos walked each day. He noticed that every Sunday morning, Duclos attended Mass at the church in Saint-Pierre, sitting proudly in the front pew with other plantation owners. There were always guards outside, but inside the church, weapons were rarely drawn. It was considered sacred ground. No one expected violence there. The idea came to him not like lightning, but like dawn, slow and inevitable. If justice could not be found in the fields, maybe it would be delivered in the house of God. Amélie sensed the change in him. One night, she held his face and asked what he was thinking. He told her only that some sins cry out for answer. She feared what that meant, yet she also carried her own storm of pain. As the weeks passed, whispers spread among the enslaved about small acts of resistance on nearby plantations, tools broken, cane fields burned at night, overseers found beaten in the dark. The island was restless. Freedom movements in other colonies were being discussed quietly. The air felt charged, as if history itself was holding its breath. Tinoe knew that whatever he chose to do would not just affect him. It could bring punishment on many. So he waited longer, studying every detail, He learned where Duclos kept his pistol, how many steps from the church door to the altar, how close he could stand without suspicion. He even volunteered for errands that brought him near St. Pierre, memorizing the streets, the corners, the shadows. Inside him, grief and fury mixed into a steady flame. He did not act from madness. He acted from calculation. And as the next Sunday approached, with clear skies and calm seas, Jean-Baptiste, called Tinoy, prepared to walk into a church where prayer would soon meet blood. The morning of the chosen Sunday arrived with a strange calm that made even the birds seem quiet. The sky above Martinique was bright blue, and the sea near Saint-Pierre shimmered like polished glass. From the slave quarters, Tinoy rose before the first rooster crowed. He washed his face slowly with cool water from a wooden bucket, then sat on the edge of his narrow bed. Amélie watched him without speaking. She had sensed for days that something was coming. The air between them carried words that neither dared to say aloud. Outside, other enslaved men began to move toward the fields, but this was Sunday, a day when work was lighter, and many were ordered to attend church as proof of their master's faith. Tinoy had already secured permission days earlier to accompany a cart delivering produce to St. Pierre. He had spoken carefully to the overseer, keeping his voice humble, his eyes lowered. The overseer, a thick-necked man named Laurent, had agreed without suspicion. Laurent believed Tinoy was broken, obedient, harmless. That belief would become his greatest mistake. Inside the hut, Amélie finally spoke. She asked him where his mind was going. Tinoy looked at her, and for the first time in months, his voice carried no confusion. He said that a wound left open will rot the whole body, and sometimes a man must cut deep to stop the poison. Amélie felt her chest tighten. She knew what Duclos had done could never be undone. She also knew that any act against a master meant death. But she did not beg him to stop. Instead, she reached for his hand and pressed something into it. It was a small wooden cross carved by her father before he was sold to another plantation years ago. She told Tinoy that whatever he did, he must remember who he was, not what they called him. He closed his fingers around the cross and nodded. As the cart rolled toward Saint-Pierre, the wheels creaked over stone and dirt. Sugarcane stalks lay bundled behind him, their sweet smell thick in the air. 2 other enslaved men rode in silence beside him, unaware of the storm hidden behind his calm face. When they reached the edge of town, the streets were already filling with people dressed in Sunday clothes. White families walked proudly toward the church. Enslaved servants followed behind, carrying prayer books or holding umbrellas against the sun. The church itself stood tall with white walls and wide wooden doors. Its bell rang again, calling the faithful inside. Tinoy helped unload the produce near a market stall as arranged. He worked carefully, not rushing, not hesitating. When the task was done, the other men prepared to return with the cart. But Tinoy told them he had been ordered to wait for a message from the house in town. This was a lie he had planted earlier, through quiet conversation with a young servant who owed him a favor. The men shrugged and left, thinking nothing of it. Now he stood alone on a street alive with voices. He could see Duclos ahead, stepping from his carriage. The master wore a dark coat despite the heat, his hair powdered lightly, his posture straight. Beside him walked his wife, unaware of the secrets inside her own home. Duclos greeted other planters with polite bows. He shook hands, smiled, even laughed softly. Tinoy felt his heartbeat steady, rather than race. He had expected anger to blind him, but instead, there was clarity.
Every step had been imagined many times in his mind. He had hidden a small knife inside the lining of his loose shirt. It was not large, but it was sharp. He had taken it from the boiling house weeks earlier, claiming it had been lost. He had sharpened it at night on a flat stone, slow and patient. The church doors opened wide. People moved inside in a slow stream. Tinoe joined them, keeping his head down like any servant accompanying a household. No one stopped him. Inside, the air felt cooler, scented faintly with incense and old wood. Sunlight filtered through high windows, casting pale beams across polished floors. At the front, Duclos and the other wealthy planters took their seats in the first pews. Enslaved attendants stood or knelt at the back. The priest began the mass in French, his voice echoing gently through the hall. Words of forgiveness, mercy, and salvation filled the sacred space. Tinoe remained near a pillar, halfway down the aisle. From there, he could see Duclos clearly. The master bowed his head in prayer, hands folded neatly. The sight stirred no hesitation in Tinoe now. Instead, he felt a deep sense of balance approaching. He remembered Amelie's tears. He remembered the sound of the whip. He remembered the quiet threat in Duclos' voice when he said no one would believe a slave. Around him, the congregation rose and sat according to the rhythm of the service. Hymns were sung, voices blending in soft harmony. The priest spoke of sin and repentance. As the Mass moved toward the moment of communion, when attention would shift toward the altar, Tinoe understood that this was the narrow window he had waited for. Guards remained outside. Inside, no one carried a drawn weapon. The sanctity of the place was its own shield, and that shield would now become the stage. Slowly, calmly, he stepped forward along the side aisle. His movements were deliberate but unhurried. A few servants glanced at him but assumed he was following an order. Duclos remained unaware. The priest lifted the chalice. The congregation knelt. Silence fell heavy and reverent. It was in that silence that Tinoe reached into his shirt and felt the cold handle of the knife.
His fingers tightened around it. For a brief second, a single thought passed through him. After this, there is no return. Yet he did not stop. He moved closer until he stood just behind the first pew. Duclos' head was bowed. His wife knelt beside him. The sunlight caught the edge of the blade as Tinoe drew it free. He did not shout. He did not curse. In one swift motion, he stepped forward and drove the knife downward into Duclos' back, aiming for the space between the ribs where he knew the heart lay. The sound that followed was not loud at first, only a sharp intake of breath from the master, a shocked gasp that broke the holy silence. Then came the scream from his wife, high and piercing. The priest dropped the chalice, and it clattered across the floor. Duclos tried to rise, but Tinoe pulled the knife free and struck again, this time into the chest as the master turned. Blood spread across the fine coat, dark and sudden. Panic exploded through the church. People shouted. Some ran toward the doors. Others froze in disbelief. Tinoe stepped back, breathing hard but steady. Duclos collapsed onto the floor of the church he had used to display his righteousness. For a brief moment that seemed to stretch like eternity, Tinoe stood over him. Their eyes met. In Duclos' fading gaze there was no longer authority, only confusion and fear. Tinoe spoke quietly, words meant only for him. He said that God sees what men hide. Then the master's body went still. Chaos swallowed the sanctuary. Guards rushed inside, muskets raised. Some people screamed for the killer to be seized. Others were too stunned to move. Tinoy did not run immediately. He knew escape would be nearly impossible, yet he had planned even for this. He moved toward the side door that led to a narrow street, pushing past bodies in confusion. A guard lunged at him, but in the crush of panic, his aim faltered. The musket fired into the ceiling, splintering wood and raining dust. Tinoy reached the side door and burst into the sunlight. Shouts followed him. Bells began ringing wildly, no longer calling to worship but to alarm. The town of St. Pierre transformed in seconds from calm to chaos. Men pointed, soldiers ran, women pulled children out of the street. Tinoy ran down a narrow alley he had memorized weeks before. His mind was clear. He knew every turn. Behind him, boots pounded on stone. As he reached the edge of town, he could see smoke rising faintly from distant sugar mills. The field stretched ahead, wide and green. Freedom was not guaranteed there, but it was a possibility. He leaped over a low wall and disappeared into the tall cane. The leaves cut lightly at his skin as he pushed through. Voices shouted behind him, growing faint, then louder, then faint again. Dogs would likely be brought soon. Hunters would spread out. But at that moment, with the sun blazing above and the taste of salt in the air, Tinoy felt something he had not felt in years. Not peace, not safety, but justice, delivered by his own hand. The church bells continued to ring in the distance, echoing across the island. And the story of the slave who had spilled a master's blood inside the house of God began to spread like wildfire. The cane fields swallowed Tinoy as if they had been waiting for him. The tall green stalks towered above his head, their sharp leaves slicing lightly against his arms and face as he forced his way deeper inside. The earth beneath his feet was dry near the surface, but damp below. And each step made a soft crushing sound that seemed too loud in his ears. Behind him, the bells of St. Pierre continued to ring in wild alarm, their rhythm broken and frantic. Shouts rose from the town like smoke. Muskets fired in the distance, not aimed, only panicked. The island had never seen such an act inside a church. A slave had struck down a master at the altar. The thought alone was enough to shake the foundations of white authority. Tinoy did not stop running until his lungs burned and sweat poured down his back. When he finally slowed, he crouched low between the cane rows and listened. The wind moved gently through the leaves, creating a whispering sound that almost felt like voices, speaking in secret. He could hear distant dogs barking now. They would release them soon. He had expected that. He had planned for that. Weeks earlier, while pretending to repair tools near the forest edge, he had studied a small ravine that cut through the land, behind the plantation fields. It led toward thicker woodland and rocky ground where scent would be harder to follow. If he could reach it before the dogs caught his trail, he would gain time. Time was everything. As he moved again, careful and low, his mind replayed the moment in the church. The feel of the knife, the look in Duclos' eyes. There was no regret inside him, only a heavy understanding that there was no path back to ordinary life. Even if he were captured within the hour, he had already done what many only whispered about in darkness. He had broken the illusion of invincibility. A master had fallen, not in a riot, not in open war, but in a place of worship. That act would echo beyond his own fate. Back in St. Pierre, chaos tightened into rage. Duclos' body lay on the church floor as his wife sobbed beside him. Blood stained the polished wood, shocking against white stone. The priest, trembling, ordered servants to clear the hall. Guards spread into the streets,
Word ran from mouth to mouth, faster than any horse. A slave named Jean-Baptiste, called Tinoy, had murdered Monsieur Duclos. Some claimed he shouted curses, others claimed he said nothing at all. Stories grew larger with every telling. Fear crept into the hearts of planters across the region. If one slave could do this, who else was watching and waiting? By midday, mounted patrols were riding hard toward the plantations. Overseer Laurent, red-faced and furious, organized men with dogs and muskets. He swore loudly that Tinoy would hang before sunset. The enslaved workers on Duclos' estate were forced into the yard and questioned harshly. Some were struck. Some were threatened with sale. Amélie stood among them, her face pale but composed. When asked where her husband might run, she lowered her eyes and said she did not know. Inside, her heart pounded so hard, she thought it might betray her. She knew the punishment could reach her too. She knew they might whip her, or worse, to draw out information. Yet she held her silence like stone. In the fields, Tinoy finally reached the ravine. He slid down the loose earth, scraping his hands, then followed the narrow channel where rainwater carved a twisting path toward the forest. The ground there was uneven and rocky. He stepped carefully on stones to break his scent trail. The dog's barking grew louder for a time, then shifted direction. Perhaps they were still in the cane. Perhaps they had not yet found where he entered the ravine. He did not wait to confirm. By late afternoon, he reached the forest line. The trees stood thick and tall, their roots twisted above ground like coiled snakes. He pushed inside, grateful for the shade. The air smelled of damp leaves and wild growth. He knew that deeper in these woods, small groups of Maroons, escaped slaves, sometimes hid in secret camps. He had never met them, but he had heard whispers. If he could find them, he might survive longer. If not, he would survive alone as long as possible. As the sun began to lower, gunshots cracked in the distance. Patrols were spreading wide now. Smoke from signal fires rose near certain estates, warning others to tighten security. The island felt like a drum pulled tight, ready to burst. Tinoy climbed a low ridge to get his bearings. From there he could see part of the coast, the sea glowing orange under the falling sun. He wondered if ships out there carried news already. News traveled quickly between colonies. A slave striking a master during mass would not remain a local secret for long. Hunger began to bite at his stomach, but he ignored it. He found a small stream and drank deeply, washing dirt from his face. The water reflected his image back to him. He looked older than he remembered, eyes darker, jaw set hard. He touched the wooden cross Amélie had given him, still tucked safely inside his shirt. For a moment, her face rose in his mind, not broken but strong. He whispered a prayer, not for escape, but for her protection. Night fell slowly, bringing a chorus of insects and distant animal calls. Tinoy moved again, choosing higher ground where visibility was better. He knew patrols would likely rest briefly after dark, then resume at first light. He needed to be far from the initial search zone by morning. As he walked, he thought of the larger world beyond Martinique. Rumors had even reached the fields of revolts in other islands, of slaves fighting back in Saint-Domingue years earlier, of uprisings crushed and uprisings that succeeded. Freedom was not just a dream. It had happened elsewhere. But here, on this island, power still felt firm and merciless. Near midnight, he heard something that made him freeze, a faint whistle, not of wind, but of a human call, soft and patterned. He crouched behind a thick tree trunk and waited. The whistle came again, closer now.
From the shadows stepped a tall man with braided hair and sharp eyes. He carried a long stick carved at the end. The stranger studied Tinoe without speaking at first. Finally, he asked quietly why the forest carried the scent of church blood. Tinoe did not pretend ignorance. He answered simply that a master had fallen. The man's expression shifted, not to fear, but to interest. He said news had already begun to spread through hidden paths. Some enslaved workers had seen the chaos in town and guessed what happened. The forest had ears, he said. The man introduced himself as Mathieu, a maroon who had lived free in the woods for several years. He did not offer friendship immediately. Instead, he asked why Tinoe had done it. Revenge alone, he warned, often leads to death without change. Tinoe replied that some acts are sparks, not solutions. Mathieu studied him longer, then nodded slowly. He said the forest could hide a man, but it demanded discipline. Patrols would comb the area by dawn. If Tinoe wished to survive the first sweep, he must move deeper and leave no sign. Together, they walked through narrow paths invisible to untrained eyes. Mathieu moved with ease, stepping lightly, avoiding dry branches. He led Tinoe toward a hidden clearing, where two small huts stood low against the earth, covered with leaves and mud for camouflage. Inside the clearing, two women and another man looked up sharply as they arrived. When Mathieu explained who Tinoe was and what he had done, silence filled the space. Not fearful silence, but heavy respect. One of the women whispered that the island would never forget this day. Yet, even in that small refuge, danger hovered close. Far off, dogs barked again. Torches flickered like angry stars, moving through the dark. The hunt had not ended with sunset. It had only grown more determined. Mathieu handed Tinoe a rough cloth to wrap around his feet to dull his scent, and told him to rest only briefly. By first light, soldiers would likely sweep the lower forest. They must climb higher into the mountains before dawn. As Tinoe lay on the forest floor, staring up at a patch of sky framed by leaves, he felt the weight of what was coming. Capture meant torture, execution, perhaps punishment for others. Survival meant constant flight. Yet beneath the fear was a quiet flame of certainty. Duclos would never harm another woman again. The man who believed himself untouchable had fallen in the place he thought most sacred. That truth could not be undone. Before sleep claimed him for a short hour, Tinoe heard distant horns sounding across the island, signals between plantations. The hunt had become official, organized, relentless. His name was now spoken not in whispers, but in shouts. And as dawn crept slowly over Martinique, the slave who had spilled blood at the altar prepared to step deeper into a battle that was no longer only his own. Dawn broke pale and gray over the mountains, and a thin mist clung to the trees, like breath that refused to disappear. Tinoe rose before the others, his body stiff from the hard ground, but his mind alert. The forest felt different in the early light. It was quieter, as if even the birds were listening for danger. Mathieu crouched near the edge of the clearing, studying the slope below. He signaled with 2 fingers that patrols were already moving. Faint voices drifted upward through the trees, mixed with the sharp bark of dogs straining against their handlers. The hunt had spread wide. Tinoe tied the rough cloth tighter around his feet. Every movement now had to be careful, deliberate. Mathieu explained in a low voice that soldiers would likely sweep in lines, pushing from the lower fields upward. They would expect a desperate man hiding close to where he had fled. They would not expect discipline, patience, or strategy. The Maroons had survived by understanding fear, both their own and that of their pursuers. Fear made white men loud. Fear made them careless. The small group left the hidden clearing before the sun fully rose. They moved uphill along narrow animal paths, stepping over exposed roots and ducking beneath low branches. The air grew cooler as they climbed. Tinoe could hear his own breathing, steady but heavy. He did not speak. His thoughts were focused on each step, each sound. Below them, a musket fired, then another. The echo rolled across the hills. It was not aimed at anything certain, only a warning shot meant to flush prey from hiding. As they reached a ridge, Mathieu paused and motioned for everyone to crouch. From that height, they could see a portion of the plantation lands in the distance. Smoke rose from several points, likely from signal fires. Riders moved along dirt roads, small figures from afar, but unmistakable in purpose. The island had mobilized. Tinoe understood then that his act had done more than kill a man. It had unsettled a system built on fear. The masters now felt what they had long forced others to feel. Back at the Duclos estate, punishment had already begun. Overseer Laurent ordered random searches of the slave quarters. Huts were overturned. Personal items were thrown into the dirt. 2 young men were tied to a post and whipped under suspicion of helping Tinoe escape. Though no proof existed, the message was clear. Obedience would be enforced through pain. Amélie endured questioning again. Laurent demanded to know if her husband had spoken of plans. She answered carefully, saying he had been quiet, burdened, but never rebellious in speech. Her calm unsettled Laurent more than tears would have. He could not read her. News of the church killing spread beyond Saint-Pierre by midday. In markets, in docks, in distant plantations, people spoke of the slave who struck during Mass. Some white families locked their doors earlier than usual that evening. Some masters forbade slaves from attending church the following Sunday, fearing another attack. The sacred space no longer felt invulnerable. The illusion had cracked. High in the forest, Tinoe and the Maroons reached a narrow ledge that overlooked a deep ravine. The path ahead was dangerous, barely wide enough for 1 foot at a time. Mathieu explained that patrols rarely climbed this high because the terrain was difficult and risky. Soldiers preferred open land where muskets could be used easily. In the mountains, skill mattered more than weapons. Tinoe followed closely, pressing his body against the rocks as he edged across the ledge. One misstep could send him tumbling into the ravine below. Yet fear did not control him. Focus did. On the other side, they entered thicker woodland, almost untouched. Here the Maroons had hidden food stores, buried in clay pots and covered with leaves. They paused briefly to eat roasted roots and dried fruit. As they rested, the older woman in the group studied Tinoe with sharp eyes. She asked him quietly if he understood what would follow if he were caught. He answered that he did. Torture, perhaps public execution. She nodded and said that sometimes a death speaks louder than a life. But she also reminded him that survival speaks longer. If he lived, he could become symbol. If he died, he would become story. Both had power, but survival carried strategy. By afternoon, the sounds of pursuit grew faint. The first wave of searchers had passed below without climbing high enough. Still, Mathieu insisted they keep moving. He explained that bounty hunters might join the chase. Some men hunted escaped slaves for reward money. They were patient and skilled trackers. The island's terrain favored those who knew it well. Tinoe listened carefully, learning quickly. He realized that vengeance had been only the first act. Now came endurance. As evening approached, clouds gathered over the peaks. Thunder rolled in the distance. Rain would help erase scent trails and confuse dogs. It would also make travel harder. When the storm finally broke, it came heavy and sudden. Sheets of rain poured through the trees, soaking everything within minutes. The group took shelter beneath a rock overhang. Water cascaded down the slope, turning soil into slick mud. Lightning flashed, bright enough to illuminate the forest, like day, for brief seconds. In those flashes, Tinoe saw the faces around him, determined and calm. They were not merely fugitives. They were a quiet resistance that had survived for years unseen. During the storm, Mathieu spoke of past rebellions. He told of men who had struck overseers in the fields, and women who had poisoned cruel masters slowly. Most had been caught. Some had escaped. None had acted without reason. The cruelty of slavery bred its own enemies. Tinoe listened, realizing he was now part of that long chain of defiance. His act in the church would not erase the system overnight, but it had added weight to the growing pressure beneath it. When the rain softened to a steady drizzle, darkness had fully settled. The forest smelled fresh and alive. Patrol fires below burned dimmer now, many extinguished by rain. The dog's barking had stopped. Tinoe felt exhaustion creeping into his limbs, but he forced himself to remain alert. He could not allow comfort to dull him. Mathieu outlined the next plan. They would travel deeper into the mountain interior where a larger maroon camp existed. There, decisions would be made about whether Tinoe should remain hidden, attempt escape by sea, or prepare for possible armed defense if soldiers pressed too far into the hills. As they prepared to move again, Tinoe looked back, once, toward the faint glow of the lowlands. Somewhere down there, Amelie endured uncertainty and danger. He wondered if she had heard of his escape. He wondered if she believed he still lived. The thought strengthened him rather than weakened him. He had not acted blindly. He had acted to end a cycle of violation and silence. Whatever happened next, Duclos would never again stand in a church pretending holiness while committing evil in secret. The group moved under the cover of night, guided by memory and instinct. The forest seemed to accept them, branches parting, shadows shifting. Insects hummed steadily, a quiet chorus of survival. Tinoe felt a strange clarity settling over him. The first stage had been fury, controlled into action. The second stage was discipline shaped into endurance, yet deep inside, he sensed that the island itself was shifting. Fear had changed direction. Masters now feared slaves not just as labor, but as thinking, feeling, remembering people capable of striking where it hurt most. As they climbed higher toward the hidden camp, a distant horn sounded again from the plains below. It was not frantic this time, but slow and deliberate, signaling continued search. The hunt was far from over, but neither was the story. And somewhere between the thunder, fading in the mountains, and the last echo of that horn, Tinoe understood that his single act inside a church had become something larger than revenge. It had become a crack in a wall that many believed would never break. By the time the storm clouds drifted away and the stars returned to the sky, Tinoe and the Maroons had reached a higher plateau deep within the mountains. The air there felt thinner and cooler. The trees were older, their trunks wide and twisted with age. Hidden among them was a larger camp,
carefully concealed with mud-covered shelters and low stone barriers built to blend into the land. A faint glow from shielded fires revealed shapes moving quietly. When Mathieu stepped into the clearing and gave a low signal call, several figures emerged from the shadows, alert but calm. Word had already arrived before Tinoe did. A young runner who moved between plantations under the disguise of selling small goods had carried the news through hidden paths. The story of the church killing had reached the mountains within hours. The leader of this maroon settlement, an older man named Baptiste Leroy, stepped forward. His hair was streaked with gray, his shoulders strong despite his age. He studied Tinoe without greeting him at first. Silence filled the clearing, broken only by the crackle of a low fire. Finally, Leroy spoke. He asked Tinoe to tell the story himself, without pride, without exaggeration. Tinoe did. His voice was steady, simple, clear. He described the years of abuse, the assault on Amélie, the hypocrisy of Duclos kneeling in church, the choice he made, and the blade that ended the master's life. No one interrupted him. When he finished, the clearing remained silent for several breaths. Then Leroy nodded slowly. He said that revenge born from justice carries different weight than revenge born from anger. But he warned that the island would not forgive this act. The French authorities would demand blood in return. Below the mountains, that demand was already forming. In Saint-Pierre, colonial officials met in urgent discussion. Duclos had been a wealthy landowner with connections in the administration. His death was not only personal, but political. A slave had attacked a symbol of order inside sacred space. That could not go unanswered. Orders were issued to intensify the search. Rewards were announced for information leading to Tinoe's capture, dead or alive. Extra patrols were assigned to mountain routes. Priests were instructed to preach obedience and calm among enslaved congregations. Fear had turned organized. On the Duclos plantation, punishment deepened. 2 men were sold away within days, accused without proof of helping Tinoe escape. The sale itself was a message meant to break morale. Amélie endured another interrogation, this time from a colonial officer rather than Laurent. He spoke more softly, but carried greater authority. He suggested that if she provided information, her safety could be guaranteed. She looked directly at him and said she had none to give. Her calm unsettled him. She had lost her master, yet she did not tremble. He could not decide if she was brave or foolish. High in the camp, Tinoe understood that remaining hidden indefinitely would not be simple. The Maroons survived because they moved carefully and avoided drawing too much attention. Now attention was burning bright. Leroy gathered the camp members and explained the danger. If soldiers climbed high enough and discovered the settlement, everyone would suffer. Some argued that Tinoe should leave and attempt to reach another island by sea. Others believed his presence could inspire greater resistance among plantations nearby. The debate was not loud, but it was serious. Tinoe listened before speaking. He said he did not seek to bring destruction upon those who had sheltered him. He had acted for his wife and for justice. If his leaving would protect them, he would go. Leroy studied him carefully. He saw no arrogance, only resolve. He finally decided on a middle path. Tinoe would remain temporarily, while scouts assessed the intensity of the search. If patrols pushed too high into the mountains, plans would shift quickly. Days passed under tension. Scouts reported that soldiers had begun exploring lower forest paths, but had not yet reached the plateau. Rain had washed away much of the scent trail. Bounty hunters searched near the coast instead, assuming a fugitive might attempt escape by boat. Meanwhile, whispers on plantations grew bolder. Enslaved workers spoke quietly at night about the man who struck inside the church. Some called him reckless. Others called him brave. Many simply listened and felt something awaken inside them, something that had long been pressed down. In the camp, Noah began training with the Maroons. He learned to move silently across steep ground, to recognize edible plants, to read distant sounds correctly. He was strong from years of field labor, but mountain survival required different strength. Each night, as small fires were shielded by stones, stories were shared. Tales of past uprisings, of near captures, of narrow escapes. Noah felt part of a larger history of resistance that had existed long before his single act. Yet danger crept closer. One afternoon, a scout returned breathless, reporting that a group of armed men had reached the lower ridge and found signs of old campfire remains from months earlier. The soldiers had not yet discovered the main settlement, but their search pattern was expanding. Leroy gathered everyone and spoke firmly. They would divide into smaller groups, temporarily to reduce risk. Supplies would be split. Meeting points would be agreed upon if forced to scatter. Noah was assigned to move with Mathieu and 2 others toward the Hidden Valley, further inland. Before departure, Leroy pulled Noah aside. He said that the act in the church had already shifted something. Planters were nervous. Church attendance among masters had decreased. Guards now stood inside during Mass. Fear had crossed the aisle, but he warned that fear can also bring cruelty. The authorities might increase punishments to restore control. Noah felt the weight of that possibility. He thought of Amélie. He knew she could suffer for his actions. That thought cut deeper than any blade. That night, before leaving the plateau, Noah stood alone for a moment at the edge of the clearing. The sky above was clear, stars scattered wide. He held the small wooden cross in his hand. He whispered Amélie's name into the quiet air. He did not know if she could feel it, but he hoped strength traveled in unseen ways. The next morning, the smaller group moved out. The path to the Hidden Valley was narrow and steep, winding between jagged rocks and dense undergrowth. Mathieu led with sharp focus. Halfway down a slope, they froze as a distant musket shot echoed. Then another. The sound was closer than before. Patrols had climbed higher overnight. A dog's bark carried faintly through the trees. The group quickened their pace, careful but urgent. The Hidden Valley was known for thick vegetation and a stream that cut through stone, creating caves large enough to conceal several people. If they reached it before the patrol line advanced, they could vanish again. But the forest seemed alive with tension now. Every snapped twig sounded like alarm. Every bird taking flight felt like exposure. As they descended, Noah felt no regret for what he had done, but he felt the full weight of what it meant to challenge power openly. He had stepped from silent endurance into active defiance. There was no illusion left. Slavery was not only chains on wrists, it was control of fear, and he had broken that control publicly. Suddenly, through the trees ahead, figures moved, not Maroons, soldiers. Blue coats visible between trunks. They had advanced faster than expected. Mathieu hissed a warning and signaled to split. Tino's heart pounded, but his mind remained clear. The chase was about to tighten again. The story that began in a church now spilled into the mountains, and as boots crushed leaves and dogs strained at their leashes, Noah understood that his survival would depend not only on courage, but on the unity of those who refused to live forever in silence.
The soldiers moved in a loose line through the trees, muskets raised, boots crushing wet leaves under heavy steps. Their dogs pulled forward with sharp, eager barks, noses close to the ground. Tinoa saw them through a break in the brush and felt the air tighten around him. Mathieu's signal had been clear. Scatter. Circle. Regroup later. Survival first. Without hesitation, Tinoe turned sharply downhill toward thicker growth. He did not run wildly. He moved fast but low, weaving between trees, stepping where roots were exposed instead of soft soil. Behind him, a musket fired. The shot tore through leaves near his shoulder, splintering bark from a tree trunk. Shouts followed. They had seen movement. The hunt had become direct. He slid down a steep patch of mud, nearly losing balance, then caught himself on a branch. The barking grew louder. The dogs had picked up something. Rain had washed much away, but not all. Tinoe reached the edge of a narrow stream and plunged into it without pause. Cold water swallowed his legs up to the knee. He moved upstream against the current, stepping on stones, forcing himself not to rush. Every instinct wanted speed, but speed left sign. He followed the stream for what felt like endless minutes before climbing out where overhanging vines concealed the bank. Voices echoed nearby. A soldier shouted that tracks led toward the water. Another cursed loudly. The dogs whined in confusion. Tinoa pressed himself flat beneath the vines, barely breathing. Through small gaps in leaves, he saw two soldiers reach the stream. One pointed. The dogs circled, uncertain, sniffing wildly. The handler urged them forward, but the scent had broken. For several long breaths, the world held still. Then the soldiers moved further downstream, assuming he had crossed rather than traveled within the water. When their voices faded, Tinoe remained motionless. He counted slowly in his mind, giving them time to widen their search in the wrong direction. Only when the forest sounds returned to normal did he crawl backward into thicker cover. He had lost sight of Mathieu and the others, but that had been expected. Each knew to make for the hidden valley by different paths. As he moved carefully uphill toward the valley's edge, his thoughts drifted briefly to Amélie. He imagined soldiers questioning her again, perhaps punishing her to force a confession. The idea pressed hard against his chest. He had acted to defend her honor, yet his action might increase her suffering. That truth hurt deeply, but he reminded himself that Duclos would have continued his violence without consequence. Silence would not have saved her. Silence would only have prolonged the pain. By late afternoon, Tinoe reached the hidden valley. It was narrower than the plateau camp, but thick with vegetation. A clear stream cut through smooth stone, disappearing beneath a rocky shelf that formed a shallow cave. He slipped inside, grateful for shadow. The space was damp, but concealed. From within, he could see a small slice of the valley floor. No movement yet. Hours passed before Mathieu appeared at the far edge of the valley, emerging slowly from behind brush. He scanned carefully before approaching. When he saw Tinoa's subtle hand signal from the cave entrance, relief flashed across his face. The others joined soon after. All had escaped the immediate line of soldiers, but the message was clear. The patrols were climbing higher and pushing deeper. That evening, as they sat in the dim shelter of the cave, Mathieu spoke quietly. The authorities were not merely searching for one man now. They were sending a warning to every maroon settlement. If they could capture Tinoe quickly and publicly execute him, they would attempt to restore the fear that had been shaken. If they failed, the fear would continue shifting. Time mattered. Down in St. Pierre, colonial officials announced that once captured, Tinoe would be hanged publicly in the town square. Notices were read aloud in marketplaces and at plantation gatherings. Masters were instructed to ensure enslaved workers attended the execution as lesson. The message was blunt. Order would be restored. But beneath that official tone lay something less stable. Several planters quietly doubled their night guards. Some sent their wives and children temporarily to safer towns. The image of Duclos bleeding inside a church would not leave their minds. On the Duclos estate, Amélie felt the tightening grip of scrutiny. She was watched constantly now. 2 guards followed her, even during simple tasks. She sensed their suspicion, yet she also sensed something else among the enslaved workers. A quiet pride, hidden but present. No one spoke openly, but eyes met differently. The master who had terrorized them was gone. That fact alone changed the air. In the valley, Tinoe lay awake long after the others slept. The cave ceiling above him was rough and low. Drops of water fell slowly from stone to earth. He replayed the events since the church, the blade, the chase, the mountains. He knew the island was tightening around him. He also knew he could not remain hidden forever. Eventually, soldiers would search thoroughly enough to threaten every hiding place. The next morning brought distant horns again. Scouts from the plateau camp arrived with urgent news. Soldiers had discovered signs of the main settlement after following a careless trail left by a younger Maroon during the storm. The camp had been abandoned just hours before patrol arrival, but it was now compromised. Fires had been destroyed. Supplies seized. The search would intensify further inland. Leroy himself appeared by midday, breath heavy, but posture firm. He gathered the scattered groups in the valley and spoke plainly. The mountains were no longer safe in their usual patterns. Too much attention had been drawn. He proposed a bold decision. Instead of remaining hunted prey, they would shift tactics. Small coordinated strikes against isolated patrols would stretch the soldiers thin and buy time for Tinoe to attempt escape by sea from a less guarded part of the coast. It was risky. Blood would likely be spilled, but constant retreat would only end in capture. Tinoe listened carefully. The plan was not about revenge now, but survival and strategy. If patrol numbers were reduced or distracted, he could move under cover of chaos toward a fishing village known for sympathizers who sometimes aided fugitives. From there, a small boat might carry him toward another island, where abolitionist voices were growing louder. He stood and spoke for the first time in council. He said he did not seek to endanger more lives for his own freedom. If capture was inevitable, he would face it alone. Leroy shook his head. He said this was no longer about one man. The act in the church had already unsettled the balance. The response now would shape how fear settled next. If slaves only ran, masters would tighten chains. If slaves resisted intelligently, masters would think twice before assuming complete control. By evening, plans were set. Over the next 2 days, Maroon groups would create diversions along lower ridges, drawing patrols away from the northeastern coast. Tinoe would travel with 2 guides toward that direction under cover of these distractions. Timing would be precise. As night fell, Tinoe stepped outside the cave and looked toward the faint glow of distant settlements. Somewhere beyond those lights stood the church, where everything changed. Somewhere beyond those lights, Amélie endured watchful eyes. He pressed the wooden cross to his lips briefly. He did not pray for safety anymore. He prayed for strength to see the path through to its end, whatever that end might be. The wind shifted through the valley, carrying distant sounds of movement. The island was restless. Soldiers sharpened blades, Maroons prepared ambushes, planters slept lightly, and Jean-Baptiste, called Tinoe, stood at the center of a storm that had begun with a single silent strike beneath stained glass windows. The next move would determine whether his story ended in chains beneath a gallows or in the open sea beyond the reach of the island that had tried to own his life. The first diversion began before sunrise. From the lower ridges west of Saint-Pierre, 2 musket shots rang out in sharp succession, followed by the sound of shouting. Smoke rose thin and sudden between the trees. Soldiers stationed near the old plateau camp rushed toward the noise, believing they had cornered a large group of Maroons. It was exactly what Leroy had predicted. The Maroons did not remain to fight long. They struck quickly, disabling 2 patrol members and vanishing into terrain only they understood. The echo of gunfire rolled through the mountains, pulling more soldiers toward the west. In the hidden valley, Tinoe listened as the sound traveled across the hills. It was the signal. Mathieu and a younger guide named Elias stepped beside him. No words were wasted. Each understood the weight of what lay ahead. The northeastern coast was several hours away, through uneven forest and narrow ravines. If patrols were distracted long enough, they might reach a small fishing cove where an old free black sailor named Marcel sometimes aided fugitives. But the timing had to be perfect. They moved fast but controlled, descending through lesser-used trails. The forest seemed alive with tension. Birds burst from branches as they passed. Twice they froze as distant voices drifted through the trees, but those voices moved away toward the diversions. Sweat soaked Tinoe's shirt as they climbed down steep slopes. He did not look back. Looking back meant doubt. By midday, they reached lower ground, where the forest thinned and the scent of salt reached their noses. The sea was near, through a gap in trees. Tinoe glimpsed blue water stretching wide and endless. For a brief moment, hope flared bright in his chest. Freedom lay beyond that horizon. Another island, another chance. But hope is fragile when hunted. As they crossed a narrow clearing near a rocky outcrop, a musket fired from behind them. The shot struck Elias in the side. He fell hard without a cry. Soldiers emerged from brush on both sides. The diversion had not drawn all patrols away. Some had circled east earlier than expected. Mathieu shouted for Tinoe to run. Tinoe hesitated only a breath, looking at Elias bleeding into the dirt. Elias met his eyes and shook his head weakly. There was no saving him now. Tinoe turned and sprinted toward the sound of waves crashing against rock. Another musket fired. The ball tore through his upper arm, spinning him sideways. Pain exploded white and hot, but he did not fall. He clutched his wounded arm to his chest and forced his legs forward. The shoreline came into full view, jagged rocks descending toward a narrow cove. A small wooden fishing boat rested half hidden behind stone. Marcel stood beside it, eyes wide in alarm as he saw the chaos unfolding behind Tinoe. Soldiers were shouting, boots pounding against gravel. Tinoe reached the boat just as another shot rang out. This one struck his back below the shoulder. The force drove him forward onto his knees. He felt warmth spreading beneath his shirt. Breath left his lungs in a harsh gasp. Marcel rushed to lift him, but Tinoe pushed him back. Soldiers were nearly upon them. If Marcel were caught aiding him, he would hang too. Mathieu's voice roared from behind as he engaged the nearest soldier with a heavy stick. A brief clash erupted. One musket fell. Another soldier stumbled, but more were coming. Too many. Tinoe struggled to stand, blood soaking through his clothes. The sea roared louder than the shouts now. He looked at Marcel and forced a faint smile. He whispered that the boat must leave, with or without him, so that the coast remained useful for others one day. Marcel's hands trembled. He did not move. Soldiers surrounded the cove within moments. Muskets leveled. Laurent himself stepped forward, face twisted in fury. He ordered Tinoy to surrender, and promised swift execution rather than prolonged torture. The promise was empty. Everyone knew it. Tinoy straightened as much as his wounded body allowed. Blood ran down his side and dripped onto the rocks. He could feel strength leaving him with each breath. The sea wind struck his face, cool and sharp. In that wind he felt something like peace, not because he would live, but because he had already changed the story. Laurent stepped closer, anger burning in his eyes. He called Tinoy murderer, savage, animal. Tinoy did not respond with rage. His voice came low and steady. He said that a man who defends his wife defends his soul. He said that masters kneel in church, but kneel to no justice. He said that God hears cries from cane fields as clearly as prayers from pews. A soldier moved behind him and struck him hard with the butt of a musket. He fell to his knees again. Chains were brought quickly. His wrists were bound tight despite blood making them slick. Mathieu, wounded but still fighting, was beaten down and restrained. Marcel was shoved aside but not seized, spared only because he had not yet touched the boat. Tinoy was dragged up from the rocks and forced to stand. The wound in his back burned fiercely. Each step toward the inland path left a faint mark of red on stone. He did not resist. His strength was nearly gone, yet his head remained high. The march back toward St. Pierre was slow and deliberate. Soldiers wanted the island to see him alive before they ended him. Along the road, enslaved workers paused from fields to watch silently as he passed. Some lowered their eyes out of caution. Others met his gaze briefly, something fierce and quiet passing between them. Word had already reached them that he had almost reached the sea. Word had already become legend. By the time they entered St. Pierre, crowds had gathered. The church doors where Duclos fell stood closed now, guarded heavily. Tinoy was taken not to a cell, but directly to the square. Officials feared that keeping him overnight might inspire rescue attempts. A scaffold was erected quickly. The noose hung waiting. Amélie stood at the edge of the crowd, held back by guards. Her face was pale but unbroken. When Tinoy saw her, the noise of the square faded. He saw only her. In that final exchange of eyes, no words were needed. She understood why he had done it. He understood what it would cost. Laurent read a declaration aloud, calling Tinoy guilty of murder and rebellion. He spoke of order and law. The crowd murmured. Some masters looked satisfied. Others looked uneasy. The illusion of untouchable power had already been shattered once. Killing Tinoy would not erase that memory. When the noose was placed around his neck, Tinoy did not struggle. He lifted his face toward the sky. Clouds drifted slowly above the town. The same sky that had watched him enter the church now watched him stand upon the scaffold. He spoke one final sentence, loud enough for many to hear. He said that chains can bind the body, but not the will of a man who knows his worth. The lever was pulled. The platform dropped. Silence fell heavy over the square. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the officials ordered the crowd to disperse. The body was left hanging for hours as a warning. But warnings do not always work as planned. Among the enslaved who returned to fields that evening, whispers did not carry fear alone. They carried memories. Duclos was gone. Tinoy was gone. Yet something else remained. The knowledge that a slave had walked into a church, into the heart of power, and struck down a master who believed himself beyond consequence. The knowledge that fear had changed direction, even if only for a season. Amelie was later sold to another plantation to break the connection, but she carried the story with her. In hushed nights, beneath different stars, she told others of Jean-Baptiste, called Tinoe, who refused silence. The story traveled across cane fields and between islands. It changed in details, but not in meaning. The island returned to its routines. Cane was cut, sugar was boiled, bells rang again on Sundays. But no master knelt in that church without remembering the blood that once stained its floor. And so the story ends not in victory of freedom, but in the tragic cost of defiance. Yet sometimes, tragedy plants seeds deeper than survival ever could. In the years that followed, resistance grew across the Caribbean. Laws shifted slowly. Voices rose louder. And though Tinoe did not live to see it, the system that claimed his life would one day fall. This has been another forgotten story, from Voices from Forgotten Souls. Remember where you are watching from. Share your city, your country, and the time you listened to this story. If you have not yet subscribed, do so now, because history remembers those who remember it.